Hello, my name is Yonit Behar, and I'm the Associate Curator at the Paul Art Museum in Chicago. And I completed my dissertation at the University of Illinois at Chicago titled Intimate Space and the Public Sphere, Margarita Paksa in Argentina's Military Dictatorship. I am extremely grateful for this invitation to present on Paksa's work. I want to thank Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, curator of the exhibition and view at ISLAA, Political Subjective Maps, Bella Geiger, Magali Lara, Lea Lublin, and Margarita Paksa. And thank you Olivia Casa and Lucy Hunter from ISLAA. In Argentina, 1968 marked the moment when the gallery site began to feel like a prison, holding artists and their work back from any contact from the outside world. This presentation focuses on Margarita Paksa's typographic work from the 1970s, the most violent time of Argentina's military dictatorship. In the 1970s, Paksa distanced herself from the art world's militancy, which was distancing itself from Paksa's convictions. She continued working, isolated, mostly at her home studio and teaching at the Villa Miserias or shanty towns, without anyone seeing the work produced, focused on developing the typographic works and drawings examined in this presentation. Paksa produced coded messages, concealing and revealing, covering and confessing. Her typographic series depended on obliqueness, since their main interrogation originates in a self-aware and also self-censored subject, incessantly calling into question the ideological nature of overtly political art. Paksa's methodology centers on her insatiable search for the suitable political aesthetic. Her works respond with skepticism to the extroversions and theatricality of the dictatorial government, paradoxically hostile to any operation perceived as inappropriate in the public dimension. Secrecy in Paksa has to do with the experience of time, namely everything in her works evoke a slower tempo, slowly unraveling itself in order to offer a gathering place of personal as well as artistic growth. When making art under persecution, it ceases to be a means of direct communication and takes on the burden and fascination of coded signals placed for an audience who would understand the messages intended for them. The many prohibitions of the time, censorship as well as self-censorship, forced Paksa to depend on cryptic communicational coding, not merely out of stylistic preference, but out of a need to push the limits of regulated speech and historical remembrance. The cultural production of Argentina's last military dictatorship begins at a point of pressure where visual culture of the highest order meets politics at the point of a gun. The question then is what was still possible and what was actually accomplished despite conditions of unthinkable prohibition, fear, and violence. Paksa's typographic work, Me cortaron las manos, or They Cut Off My Hands, from 1973, was dedicated to the Chilean musician, poet, and political activist Víctor Jara, who was tortured during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. His hands were cut off to disable his guitar playing, and he was mocked by his torturers, who forced him to play the guitar with dismembered hands before killing him. Jara's torture is just one example of the extreme cruelty and violence of the junta that came to power in Chile on September 11, 1973. Paksa was well aware of the military dictatorships overpowering neighboring countries such as Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil, and sympathized with Jara in particular, who was an early victim of the coup because he had aligned himself with Chile's working and peasant populations, singing songs about the hardships of lower-class life. Written as a coded message, Paksa's Me cortaron las manos is a small work on paper made using letraset, a letter transfer system in which pre-printed letters on a transparent sheet are struck onto another substrate via rubbing, not drawn but imprinted. Paksa's choice to work with letraset is not arbitrary. As she explained, and I quote, "I didn't want to draw the letters by hand, because if I was against traditional painting and sculpture, I was also against traditional drawing movements. I wanted to emphasize technique, mechanics, to remove myself from any trace of humanity," end quote. There is a level of gestural removal in this technique that makes it not as closely physical or subjective as drawing. But to use letraset, one must also be skilled and careful. Rubbing the letters too softly will fail to detach them fully from the letraset sheet. This is to say that even though the words in the work are not hand-drawn, they bear evidence of the artist's hand, of the smudges and residues left during the process of the application. Me cortaron las manos points to the difficulty of doing without hands, the absence of participation and action of the artist. The fragmented words call for an active viewer who can make the connections between the words. The size of this work is also important in relation to ideas of engagement and its relationship to the viewer. It is relatively small, measuring 17 by 17 centimeters, about the size of a hand. Paksa was quite deliberate about the size of the work in relationship to its content. It effectively replaces Jara's cut-off limbs by giving them another presence, like ghost limbs. The piece was made using an energetic technique at a small scale, but the reading of it is rather onerous. The breaks in the words recreate violence, recalling the dismembering and mutilation of bodies. Letters that are discontinuous metaphorize the atrocity of the act, which is repeated in the language of the body. The shape, size, and placement of the letters on the page contribute to a message in which destruction and construction are inseparable. In the case of Paksa, as in that of so many others who have suffered personally or vicariously, the destructive actions of violence, either in their own flesh or in someone else's, they responded by creating and building to counteract the damage as a way to counteract destruction. Paksa's choice to write about the mutilation of Jara's hands in particular connects to her own fears of not being able to continue living as an artist or making art freely. She understood that not being able to create is losing one's humanity. Manos, or hands, is a word that for a Spanish speaker has a poetic resonance with humano, or human. In the word humano in Spanish, there is also included the word man in English, a transit between languages which confirms a pre-Babel vision in which the possibility of crossing languages is also a crossing between different forms of creation. This interjection legitimized the fusion of mediated imagination that distinguishes less and less the different experiences between visuality from the experience of verbality. For Paksa, the relation between the formal, visual aspects of typography and the production of meaning was central to the work. Paksa practiced a visual poetics that sought to leave intact the material of the hand gesture through which the signifier emerges. There is not enough time today to expand on this, but it is important to say that Paksa's text, her works with text, follow directly from her installations of the preceding years. Far from isolated, formal experiments, they are only apparently unrelated to her three-dimensional projects. Rather, we should regard the works on paper as continuing her focus on the materiality of the object in relationship to space, as well as on an active audience engagement, all while carrying an intentionally resistant message. Between the late 1960s and mid-1970s, Paksa developed the series Diagrama de Batallas, or Battle Diagrams. These are a single cartography in which she introduced written messages while simultaneously pointing out the geographical sites of repression. Paksa made each of these diagrams corresponding to real events such as guerrilla confrontations and civil unrest that took place in different locations in Argentina. The series Diagramas de Batallas referred back to Paksa's earlier works from Situaciones fuera de foco, out of focus situations, made using letraset, where she alluded to the political situations of her own country as well as neighboring countries such as Uruguay. In Situaciones fuera de foco, black and white words like justicia or justice, as we see here, appear as if seen through the crosshairs of a rifle's scope. The connection between weapon and camera is almost inevitable. In English, if one considers that to shoot can describe the action carried out with either. Images are fired like bullets, thanks to the sight of the rifle or the objective of the camera, a lethal coincidence between names and techniques. Creation and death are reconciled not by the same instruments, but by the same voice, to shoot. The person looking through the camera or the gun scope presumably had their finger on a trigger or shutter release. If it's a gun, the viewer is an assassin. If it's a shutter release, the viewer is a documentarian. Regardless, both are observers, but on behalf of different people. Paksa characterized the works in this series as situations out of focus, blurred, confused, indeterminate. Even though the most obvious interpretation could be that some letters in a given word are more out of focus than others, given the crosshairs in the composition, the reference could also be to focismo, or focal theory, a strategy for revolution associated with the Argentinian Marxist Ernesto Che Guevara and developed by the French intellectual and government official Brigitte Debray. Even though she calls the works out of focus, namely outside of the focus or guerrilla group, Paksa's works are not abandoning politics. By being out of focus, Paksa's piece performs a potent form of aesthetic, semiotic, and political delay that responds both to the risk of that moment, but also to the necessity of action in the future. While the works in Situaciones fuera de foco series are graphically relatively simple, the Diagrama de Batallas are more complex, including maps with specific locations and situations of the state of siege at that moment, adding layers of socio-political specificity. Justice did not look the same nor mean the same thing in 1968, as the work on the left, as it did in 1974, like the work on the right. If there was any question whether the crosshair in the earlier series were from a weapon, now there is more certainty that we're in fact viewing from a gun's point of view. The map pinpoints the specific places where the leftist urban guerrilla groups, the Montoneros, was engaged in conflicts in La Calera, a town in the district of Córdoba in northern Argentina. On July 1, 1970, the Montoneros took over the police station of La Calera, a bank was robbed, the telephone exchange was seized, and its equipment disabled. And lastly, a box was left in the corner of the bank, an alleged explosive that actually contained a recording of a Peronist march. These maps represent the artist's stance regarding this event. In Paksa's point of view, as her work reads, the attack by the Montoneros at La Calera was searching for justice. In other words, with her maps, Paksa attempts to counter official cartographic schemes and representations of space, and instead uses maps and discourses of cartography tactically and transgressively for political ends. As a leftist Peronist, Paksa herself was actively involved with the Montoneros from 1970 to 1974, while teaching art in the shantytown Villa Miseria at La Matanza, right outside Buenos Aires. But she soon became disillusioned with the violence that was promoted from both the Peronists' right and left wings, and disengage from the Montoneros. In 2010, she recalled, quote, "They killed each other. Fuck everyone. What I most hated about Peronism is that ability to kill each other physically," end quote. Paksa's diagramas de batallas focus on the resistance from the guerrilla groups who opposed and attacked the military. These battle diagrams are interpretations of actual battles organized by the left-wing guerrilla groups, with Paksa acting like a war artist. A war artist is generally commissioned through an official scheme to record the events of a war. In the case of Paksa, she was self-motivated to document her experience of war in the form of an illustrative record or a depiction of how war shapes lives. Many works by war artists serve as documents of a time, telling a history that would otherwise be lost. The only way for Paksa to transmit her message was to make it barely perceptible, given the personal risks of dissent under an authoritarian and dictatorial regime. She opted for secrecy, which is a form of silence, or rather resistance in the two senses of the verb, to oppose and fight as much as to continue resisting, opposing and fighting despite the risks. This was a time when everyone in Argentina was called to battle, and I quote, "Citizens, assume your obligation as reserve soldiers. Your information is always useful. Bring it to us," end quote, declared General Jorge Rafael Videla in 1975. Paksa was doing the opposite by coding her messages. Paksa was obsessed with the meaning of art at the same time that she was trying to capture the experience of life under dictatorship and push back with caution against its oppressive constraints. In Paksa's typographic works, the viewer is also the participant. We, the viewer, become a reader, doubling our vision or dividing it in a reflecting act by which we see and read at the same time. Written in encoded ways, Paksa's works call for an active observer who can make the connections between the words and the world. Conceptual art in Argentina and the dematerialization of the art object came to fruition during the dictatorship as a way to resist authority and find other possible ways to communicate, not necessarily ceasing to provide ground for expressive practices, but quite the opposite, by exchanging expression for introspection. In other words, this introspection is not one that is meant to be for a single monadic person. Paksa's works are in fact made for communities linked by survival and shared trauma. Thank you.